So in this segment, we're going to be discussing this really interesting interview Zoe Gardner did with someone, I believe, at LBC, where she kind of dispels some of the ideas of just offshoring our asylum seeker process. And so this kind of debunks some of the ideas I had as well, so it's very informative. And she's very good at discussing issues around, I think, immigration and asylum seekers, especially asylum seekers. So let's have a listen.
Back, I think it was in Theresa May's administration, there was talk that France wanted to fund a processing centre on French soil.
France wanted us to fund it.
And it was rejected. I believe Theresa May used the words on ideological grounds, I think, as blunt as that. And I guess I'm one of those who was sort of persuaded that maybe the best way of dealing with those making the journey across Europe from wherever would be to process them in France before, so that we wouldn't have to have people crossing the channel in order to get processed and be deemed a legitimate asylum seeker.
Yeah, I think it's understandable, and a lot of people who respond to this from a humanitarian perspective are tempted by this idea. And so I think it's important to sort of lay out what it actually means in practice versus sort of the idea of it, which sounds like, oh, it stops people from crossing the channel. Great. In reality, I don't think it would stop people from needing to cross the channel. And I think it would be extremely costly and very dangerous in terms of human rights. And the very concept of offshoring our asylum process to France is extremely complicated.
And this is just France she's discussing here, because Labour, and they'll discuss it later in the interview, have talked about offshoring it to, I think it's Tanzania. So this is, I don't know the politics of Tanzania, but France is a country that's very close to us, geographically speaking. And she explains why it's a bad idea just offshoring it to France.
In the first place, because what we'd need to do is we would need to accommodate however many people arrive in France and wish to come to the UK in France in conditions that at the current time it's very difficult for actors such as myself or legal actors or human rights defenders and advocates to gain access to accommodation centres and ensure that they are adequate and living up to the standards that are required to protect people. That would be extremely much more difficult if the people were being accommodated overseas. We would have no oversight over the system there. We would also have to transfer a huge number of our own British staff over to France, which would be hugely expensive and costly, and again would remove our ability to have adequate oversight over the procedures that were going on there.
It would also make training more British staff difficult, because if you're sending over more staff to France to process claims, you're going to have less staff here, which might make training more difficult. So we need to increase the amount of people we have processing people's asylum claims. That's a fact. Like, that's one of the reasons why we're so far behind. So that would make training more people to do this job a lot more difficult, I think. So again, like this idea, it just, on paper it sounds very good, but in principle it's not a good idea, especially when you're talking about lawyers and judges. They'll have to potentially do these hearings over video call. You'd also need translators. Translating is difficult at the best of times. Doing over a video call would be a complete nightmare.
There are lots of people involved in an asylum decision. People need lawyers. It's very difficult to access lawyers at the current time in the UK. It would be made, again, far more difficult if those people were not in the UK to access competent legal advice on the legal asylum system in the UK. We need translators. Again, people don't have sufficient access to that now. So all of that would need to be offshored to another location. And then once you talk about when decisions are made, when people go through the appeals process, again, what that appeals process is through our British system. It would be difficult to ensure that it was adequately done abroad. And finally, when you get to the point of a decision, yes, for those, and let's emphasise this is the vast majority of people at the moment who are trying to make the crossing, they are people who are recognised under our system as refugees in need of protection. But for those who are rejected, we're then leaving a population of people who have no further option, no rights in a country where we have no control again over what happens to them. And the concern is that in many cases, people are refused asylum wrongfully, or they're refused asylum, but they actually still have no solution whatsoever of where to go. And we end up dumping that onto another country, and those people remain desperate, remain destitute, and might end up still continuing to fuel the trade, the smuggling trade, and attempting to reach us in other ways. But then when they crossed, they would try to remain outside of the system because the trust in our system that to be able to offer them any kind of solution would be totally broken.
We already have a black market for labour in terms of people who are here potentially illegally, who work in very unsafe conditions, well below minimum wage. And if they get injured or hurt, they're just binned off, essentially. You know, they can't get healthcare because they won't be allowed to because, like, the rules around the NHS, even though the medical professionals would look after them regardless, they would want to stay outside the system because they wouldn't be able to afford it. So there is already a black market for labour in this country in terms of workforce. So this would further add to that. It would, you know, enrich these smugglers, but also when these people get here, they'd either be homeless, most likely they'd be homeless, or they would try to find work within the black market because they wouldn't be here legally, they wouldn't have papers, etc.
So ultimately, I think this would produce more cost and more chaos, but actually no solutions. And I can tell you what solution I do propose.
Go on. I was going to ask you, what is the solution? What is the answer?
Well, I think that the people who believe that we should process people in France, what they've got onto the right idea, which is that we should stop people from having to make that dangerous journey before they can actually reach our system. Now, how we can actually do that instead is we can set up a centre in France, but a much smaller scale, just to offer people who come to us, and we can set up the criteria, but basically it needs to be fairly broad because it needs to be realistic. People who have decided that where they wish to seek safety is the UK, we can give them a travel document that so we know who they are, we have this all done in a regulated and formalised manner, but we give them a travel document, they cross on the ferry or the Eurostar instead of in the smugglers' boats, and then they enter the asylum system in the UK, and we have that system functioning, and crucially functioning quickly and efficiently here in the UK, instead of trying to push it all overseas, because then the French can push theirs to Italy, and then the Italians can start running their asylum system as they're trying to do in Albania, and in the end, none of this prevents the actual need. It's all trying to displace the question. Where...
And this is what we've seen, you know, the situation that has been pushed onto Italy and Greece, and you know, you've had people move into France. So it's been pushed onto, I think, predominantly these three countries, and it's grossly unfair. And I think that the difference in the way the refugee crisis was dealt with in the early 2010s and now versus the way, you know, the Ukrainian refugee crisis has been dealt with, you can kind of see the issues around that. Kind of the two different things that have been done to people.
Where are people going to actually end up and stay? We should be focusing on offering solutions, not trying to push people away.
Let me return you to this. I mean, I'm loath to call it a proposal because it's all leaks that have gone to the Times. But if going with the information in good faith that's in the Times, Labour are going to say that their scheme involves Tanzania, which, according to Wikipedia, is one of the most stable and nicer places to be in Africa, in the African continent, that they're going to ensure that the processing is done by British officials. Does any of that mitigate for you? I mean, I can see that compared to Rwanda, which is, I mean, to my mind, it is just an abhorrent policy, that Tanzania would be more appealing than Rwanda, but it's a long way short of what you're discussing or proposing, Zoe.
Yes, obviously, Rwanda has specific difficulties in the fact that it is like a repressive dictatorship without a free press and without human rights protections and so on. That is particularly bad. But, I mean, I think your listeners will understand that there is this is what's so dangerous, is the conversation has shifted to such a degree that we're talking about Tanzania, sending refugees to Tanzania as being the sort of more moderate and humane option. I'm afraid it's not. It's simply not, and we need to push back against this really strongly. It's actually very dangerous. It is not acceptable and will not work. It's untested, unproven, unsupported by any evidence, and it is cruel. It is about punishing people, and it is about ultimately saying that they shouldn't be here, and that is the wrong message.
And this is where you kind of, you know, people are, you know, browbeaten into accepting half measures when we should accept a lot better. We should want a lot better. And my question to those people who keep saying vote Labour no matter what, and, you know, we shouldn't criticise them and whatever. Are you happy with this policy? Because chances are they are going to try and push through it. If it's in the manifesto, they will probably try and do it. So are you happy with this policy? How do you plan on combating these bad policies? because how much of a difference is there between Rwanda and Tanzania if you're just going to send people there? It doesn't make sense. And this stuff is leaked to the Times, which is incredibly frustrating because it's paywalled. Why they keep leaking stuff to the Times, I don't know. You got more from Zoe Gardner. She talks about Labour confirmed this morning that offshoring processing claims is on the table for them, disgraceful, harmful, etc. She talks about how these kind of policies are aimed to annoy people like her and aim for red wall voters who she thinks politicians think are way more bigoted, which I would agree with. I don't think the red wall are as bigoted as people think. And she talks about the poll saying people want levelling up and investment for public services. This kind of culture war stuff could have worked, I think, during the mid-2010s, but I think during a cost of living crisis, what people are more focusing on that rather than anything else. And this is the conversation the Tories want to have on Rwanda, on asylum seekers, because it's easy for them. That this is the battle they want to fight, and it's very stupid of Labour to get baited into this when they should be focusing more on the economy and just saying like, all you guys have is the culture war. You're not looking out for the interests of British people. The interests of British people are things like actually levelling up and investing in the economy, investing in areas that are heavily deprived. That's what Labour should be focusing on. And she goes on to say that to ask yourself why exactly zero of all experts, lawyers and humanitarians who work with refugees and advocate for their rights support processing asylum claims in France, if that's such an obvious answer, which is true. There's a couple other bits I wanted to talk about, which is Sue Gray stopping the briefings against Andy Burnham, which about time that's finally happened. So it kind of vindicates Starmer's pick for Sue Gray, but also the fact that Starmer's weak leadership, because he should have dealt with this ages ago. Andy Burnham had said months ago he wanted to be left alone. So this is a good move from Sue Gray, but I think it shows you how weak I think Starmer is in some areas, letting a bunch of unelected people within the Labour Party brief against an elected mayor sucks. They have got some policies on childcare, which is good, using existing schools as places for nurseries makes a lot of sense. Like, this policy really makes a lot of sense. The question is, how are they going to fund it? Is it going to be via getting rid of the VAT loophole for private schools, or the VAT hole for private schools, the non-dom tax? Like, how exactly are they going to fund this? Because Labour keep talking about not wanting to borrow money, even though this will put money back into the economy, because it allows more people to get back to work. So again, a good policy. How they're going to fund it, I don't know, and there's going to be a lot of question marks on how they're going to fund it. And there was this speech by Gordon Brown who talks about the last Labour government's achievements, which there are still problems with some of the stuff they did. There was still a lot of poverty, but it's better than what it is now. The question is, would Labour even do some of these policies that this kind of centre-left version of Labour actually implemented? So let's have a listen to his speech.
Then look at what we have achieved together since 1997. The winter fuel allowance, the shortest waiting times in history, crime down by a third, the creation of Sure Start, the cancer guarantee, record results in schools, more students than ever, the Disability Discrimination Act, devolution, civil partnerships, peace in Northern Ireland, the social chapter, 500,000 children out of poverty, maternity pay, paternity leave, child benefit at record levels, the minimum wage, the ban on cluster bombs, the cancelling of debt, the trebling of aid, the first ever Climate Change Act. That's the Britain we've been building together. That's the change.
So, I have real question marks of if this kind of Starmer Labour government would be even as good as the Blair government, which, when you read something like Marcus Rashford's story, the poverty he grew up in, that was under a Labour government. So, I do have real question marks for kind of new Labour, the 97 to 2010. But, I've got a feeling, and it will frustrate me if it comes true, that Starmer's first 5 years in charge, he will not be anywhere near as even progressive as even Blair's Labour were. And that is a big fear I have, because after 5 years, if you have nothing to show, you're really letting the door open for the Tory party. The best way to keep the Tories out is a competent Labour Party who actually do the right things. But I don't know if this version of the Labour Party will do it. So a mixed bag, good policy here. The rest of it, this also good. The rest of it on immigration and asylum seekers, not very good. So a mixed bag, but we move. And shouts out to Zoe Gardner for kind of laying this out in a very easy way for, I think, most people to understand. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Let's stop accepting half measures and ask our politicians to actually do better. That's the only way we'll improve things. And I'll catch you in the next one.